Kirsty Gogan from Energy for Humanity. It's an environmental NGO. You've worked for a long time with these issues in different roles. I think you've been at Downing Street, right?
Yeah.
In the UK. So you've had different perspectives on this issue, but it worked for many years with nuclear and decarbonisation. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. Very pleased to be here. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to come to Stockholm. As Marcus said, I've worked in sustainability pretty much my whole career, and as an environmentalist, I was really by default anti-nuclear. But in light of climate change, I looked at nuclear again and found sort of two important insights. Firstly, that solving climate change just with renewables alone is going to be extremely difficult. And it really looks like a high-risk strategy to try to do that. And we should really be trying to mitigate the risks that we're facing in terms of climate change as much as possible. And secondly, almost everything that I thought I knew about nuclear was wrong. So I'm going to speak today a little bit about the three dimensions of sustainability. I'm going to whiz through some sort of, sustainability characteristics of nuclear energy from the perspective of environmental, economic, and social. And then we're going to sort of look at the larger global picture a little bit more as well. So I'm just showing this report cover called Sustainable Nuclear that we published in the summer. And I know Jessica's going to speak about the EU Sustainable Finance Taxonomy that's currently been under consideration, and the recommendation around nuclear was we don't know, unsure. We're not sure whether or not nuclear really does cause harm to sustainability objectives or really contributes towards them. And so we published a report in response to that. That's my consulting firm, Lucid Catalyst, and we worked with Think Atom, which is a Finnish-based non-profit. And the authors here, you can see Rowley, who's from Think Atom, and Stefan Kvist, of course, a very famous Swedish analyst and author who works on these issues, and myself and my business partner, Eric. So you can look at that report and find all kinds of information, but I'm not going to share that with you now. I'm going to share first of all, as an environmentalist, the main kind of thing that swung it for me, apart from the zero carbon piece, is the energy density. Because actually uranium is something like 2 million times more dense as an energy source than other sources like coal and so on. And so that has a read across across the whole life cycle, from the mining footprint to the land footprint and ultimately, of course, to the waste footprint. So a huge factor. And just to sort of illustrate that, here's Diablo Canyon, California's last nuclear plant, which generates twice as much power as all of the solar panels at the time in California. In terms of footprint, if we care about protecting biodiversity, we care about habitats, we really need to be looking at energy technologies, energy solutions that have a very small ecological footprint. Here's another illustration of this point. That's Hinkley Point C. To generate the same power as Hinkley Point C, which will supply 7% of total UK electricity with wind or solar, we would be talking about a much larger environmental footprint on what is already, a relatively small and crowded country. So this little, let's see if this works, this little animation, maybe I'll need to click here, makes this point again. This is a little animation that we created together with the Idaho National Lab. We made this kind of website called EcoLogic, which really looks at, a lot of the sort of sustainability dimensions of our energy choices that we're facing in light of climate change and in light of rising global energy demand, including the social dimensions, the economic dimensions, and crucially the ecological dimensions. We currently have around 7 billion people on the planet. We will have, by mid-century, it's estimated around 10 billion people on the planet. Half of those people today lack access to enough electricity to gain modern energy services that we take for granted, things like access to a washing machine. I mean, if you talk to a room full of environmentalists and say, would you be prepared to fly less? Generally, yes, people would be prepared to fly less or eat less meat, make personal sacrifices like that. But if you ask them if they'd be prepared to give up their washing machine, that's a different kind of story. So access to energy is profoundly important for our quality of life. a kilogram of coal will power a light bulb for around 4 days, whereas a kilogram of uranium will power that same light bulb for 685 years. So I'm just, I'm really like laboring the density point here. But while I'm doing that, what about the waste? Well, I love this. This is a tweet by Paris Ortiz Wines from Environmental Progress in the United States. And she's like, everyone's like, but what about the waste? It always comes up as an issue. What about the waste? And she's like, yeah, what about it? Because actually, the nuclear industry is the only industry that takes full responsibility for its waste and contains it safely. Nuclear waste has never harmed anybody. It's never going to harm anybody. This issue is completely overblown. And if you compare it to the fossil fuel industry, which is just chugging its waste stream out into the atmosphere, causing, of course, millions of premature deaths per year through air pollution, but also, of course, contributing towards climate change. It's really important that we're thinking about these things in context. And one of the sort of themes here in my talk today that I want to sort of urge you to think about, and hopefully we'll discuss more during the day, is really whether or not we consider the so-called risks or constraints around nuclear energy in the context of risks and constraints associated with other energy technologies. We all know the statistic, I'm sure, that if you used nothing but nuclear energy for your whole life, for all of your energy needs, the high-level waste that would be produced as a result of that would fit inside a Coke can. And of course, we know that nuclear is low carbon. It's one of the critical reasons that we're all now in the environmental community looking again at nuclear, despite, of course, a long legacy of being in the mainstream environmental movement, being very opposed to nuclear. Nuclear so far has avoided the release of 56 gigatons of CO2, which is equal to almost 2 years of total global emissions just so far. And actually, according to James Hansen, has even saved 1.8 million lives by displacing coal and gas and the associated avoided air pollution. So, yes, as we saw previously, nuclear is indeed the safest form of electricity generation. But why is it that people think it's the most dangerous? I'll come back to that. Another question, isn't it too slow? Well, let's look at the real world data. Let's see how much clean generation can be added in 10 years based on our real world experience to date. And you can see everything here that's in blue is all nuclear. We have UAE as projected there, and then you can see the wind and solar. So despite, really impressive success in building out wind and solar and driving down costs of wind and solar, nuclear still holds the record for by far the greatest amount of per capita kilowatt hours added per year annually. And of course, Sweden, wins the prize for the best of all. This is a graph from Stefan Kvist and Barry Brooks' excellent paper where they concluded that no other carbon-neutral electricity source has been expanded anywhere near as fast as nuclear energy. And not only was all of that clean energy deployed extremely fast, but it was also whilst driving up GDP and driving down air pollution and carbon emissions. So those are the kind of metrics that we want to see. In fact, overall, this is a study that the Economist Intelligence Unit carried out to say, well, what has been the most impactful way of reducing carbon emissions to date globally? And actually, number one was the Chinese one-child policy, because they weren't only looking at energy attitudes, but then, of course, as we said a moment ago, access to energy profoundly impacts our quality of life, and it is actually something that, as the population of the world increases, and as citizens of the world today, of poor countries that don't have access to energy, we need to really think about the link between population and access to energy. But in fact, nuclear power has been the second most successful way of reducing carbon emissions overall globally to date. It's really not given the credit for that, though, is it? And so that's the, interesting thing about nuclear energy and its sort of the perceptions of the contribution that it's made. And I'll speak about that in just a moment. But first of all, isn't it too expensive? Now, given the sort of discussion that we just had, I'm a bit sorry that I just haven't delivered to you today my cost. My talk about nuclear cost, but I will summarize by saying we have done a lot of work on this. There's a study that we carried out for the UK government to understand what drives the cost of nuclear, and the reason that we were commissioned to do that study was because we know that there are plants today in the world being delivered for half or even a third of the cost that nuclear is being delivered for in Europe and in the United States. And the UK government was saying, well, hang on a minute, we're looking at Hinkley Point C, it being built in the UK, and nuclear looks very expensive and slow. And actually, people are legitimately asking the question, can we depend on nuclear to make a meaningful contribution towards solving climate change when these projects are so expensive and they're running over budget and they're running over schedule? And so the conclusion that we found in this study, and I'm sorry, this is a slightly busy slide here. So this is the kind of, this is what we're seeing today with, the plants that are being built in France, in Finland, in the United States, and the UK. They're expensive. They're all first-of-a-kind projects. In fact, they're all first-of-a-kind, first-in-country, first-in-a-generation projects. And that means that you need to spend a lot to rebuild the skills and capability within your workforce, to qualify your supply chain, to license your design working with an inexperienced regulator, and to establish experience and skills within the leadership, the project leadership team. Now, as soon as you've built that plant, and you've completed the design and it's fully licensed and you've built it once, when you go to build your second plant, we would anticipate a very steep reduction in cost for that second-of-a-kind plant. And the reason is that simply you do not need to spend all of that money again, because your supply chain is qualified, your labor force is trained, experienced, they know what they're doing. You can optimize the constructability. You're not sort of dealing with a situation where you're still having design engineering being delivered to the supply chain while the construction is underway, which is a situation that we have today in all of those first-of-a-kind, first-in-a-generation projects. And then after that, you see maybe a 30%, we're anticipating in the UK, a 30% cost reduction from first-of-a-kind to second-of-a-kind. And beyond that, then you get into your programmatic learning. That's when then you really start optimizing and you improve efficiency and so on. And if you even go further and you look at advanced manufacturing techniques, prefabrication, and other, modern ways of speeding up the schedule, increasing budget and schedule certainty, you can even achieve further cost reductions very significantly. And we're seeing that particularly with the small modular reactors that are now being developed, even the light water small modular reactors, because they're being built not as projects, or they're being designed not as projects, but as products that will be developed using advanced manufacturing techniques. The design will be complete. They'll be developed for much shorter schedules and overall much more cost efficiency. So we could spend some more time on costs, but just to say that the rest of the world costs that are being delivered today, that are down there in that $3,000 range, and this is an average, so there are much cheaper ones as well, don't forget, in Korea, in Japan, in China, and Russia. Some people would say, well, isn't labor cheap in China? Maybe corners are being cut on safety. That's how these low costs are being achieved. Well, it's really helpful to remember that actually during the US program, the best experience, and this is again a kind of an amalgamation of a large number of plants. They have 100 reactors in the United States. That actually the best experience averaged out was also not far off what's being delivered today in China and Japan and other countries that have established programs. Because the reason that those plants are cheap today in other parts of the world is because they've just got good at it. And we can do the same, and we could certainly do the same again in Europe because we've done it before. So what does success look like from a climate perspective? Because actually that's really why, I get out of bed in the morning. Many of you may have seen the electricity map before. We produced a report together with the creators of the electricity map called the Climate Leadership Report to establish which countries in Europe are doing well on climate and, how well are they doing. And what we found is that the countries that show up as green all year round, they have a very low carbon intensity in their electricity generation. And they've achieved that through a combination of nuclear and renewables. In fact, what we found, interestingly, was that there is no correlation between low carbon intensity and a large build-out of wind and solar unless you also have clean baseload power. And it really is that combination that makes the difference. That's what will get your carbon intensity down, because there really are only 3 ways to produce clean baseload power to back up intermittent sources of energy, and that's coal and gas, hydro and nuclear. And in the UK, we've made the largest overall reduction in carbon emissions over a 5-year period through a combination of replacing coal with gas, building a lot of renewables, and maintaining our nuclear fleet. That's the secret of success. That's what success looks like. So what do we need to do? Well, so globally, the kind of goals here that we have, of course, we need prosperity, and that really, needs to be thought about in the context of a largely urbanized population. We need decarbonisation. And what's the reality that we're in today? Well, 3.5 billion people live in large cities now. By 2050, we'd anticipate it will be much greater, 7 to 8 billion people living in cities. Where will the energy come from? Right now, largely powered by coal. And coal capacity is still increasing. Although we're celebrating retiring some of our old coal plants in Europe, in fact, the average age of coal plants globally is getting younger, because new coal plants are coming online in Asia and other countries that will continue to generate for decades to come. So one of our real challenges is going to be what we do about that legacy stock. In fact, in the World Energy Outlook published by the International Energy Agency, just in December, the legacy coal plants was one of their top 3 issues that they highlighted. Protests can't solve this problem because coal is the way out of poverty. And we all know, as I've mentioned earlier, that increased energy access actually very strongly correlates to development and to all of the other kinds of metrics that we care about, such as infant mortality, and illiteracy rates, and well-being for women and children. One of the things that's really depressing for me when I look at future energy forecasts is even with a very ambitious and a very aggressive build-out of wind and solar, we still see a lot of fossil on the system. 60% in 2050. Here's just 2 example studies, EIA and DNV, both with still very, very large amounts of fossil fuels still on the system in 2050. So I want to spend a few moments on meditating now on this chart. I'm sure you've all seen it before. It's from the IPCC. And, it can seem a little abstract. It's a kind of complicated chart, and 2050 seems like a long way away. Well, my daughter will be the age that I am now in 2050. And that really brings, for me, the deadline into sharp relief. Because, my daughter's generation are going to really want to know what we did in this critical decade. We talk about 2050 like it's a long time away, but here we are in 2020. This decade is the decade that matters, because this decade is the decade when we make the decisions, when we put the plans in place, where we really start to make those shifts towards the infrastructure that we're going to need. So how do we make that happen whilst also growing energy access? One thing that my business partner Eric likes to point out when he shows this chart is that he likes skiing, but this line here is much too steep even for him to want to ski down, right? And of course, what we know about this very steep line over here is the longer that we wait, the deeper the cuts need to be. So what do we need to do if we're going to make something like this happen whilst growing energy access? Well, the first thing to point out about this chart is the very short time. I'm not sure if I've got a pointer on here. So we've got 30 years. It's really not long to replace global fossil fuel infrastructure across our entire economy, not just the power sector, which is only 1/5, but actually liquid fuels, which represents the other 75-80%, across heat, transport, industry. And we have a lot to do. We have to repower all those coal plants with some kind of new heat source. There's a lot of them, remember. More than 5,000 plants will be operating. We need to convert all those liquid fuels something carbon neutral. We need to replace natural gas with hydrogen or ammonia. We need a massive increase in African generating capacity because, as I said, not only do we need to replace all of those fossil fuels, but probably double or triple the energy capacity in order to meet rising global energy demand. And we need to electrify as much as possible, really, really fast. So wait a second, because sometimes when we look at this chart, we forget. What's this? Hang on a minute. This is zero. What happens below the line here? Yeah, that's the negative emissions. We're going to need, we anticipate, another 600 gigawatts for carbon removal, maybe in the second half of the century. So for those of you, for example, who say, oh, fusion, it won't come through until the middle of the century, it's like, let's have it. We're going to need it. We're going to need all the clean, large volumes of electricity generation that we can get. Now, the good news is that we have done something like this before, because actually, if you look at the kind of rate of build-out, we increased our energy generating capacity by 5 times in 67 years. That's the other side of that mountain, the mountain that we had to ski down. Well, this is how we climbed it, by adding all of that energy. So the world needs genuine zero carbon substitutes for coal and oil and gas, and that's the reality that we're facing. It has to be cheap, it has to be abundant, it has to be clean, reliable, safe, and fast to deploy. We need to be able to repower existing coal plants. So the likelihood of getting onto these pathways is already kind of slim, even with the existing technology that we have available. We're going to need to really think hard about how we deploy that technology, and that's the last sort of part of my talk that I want to move into next. It's worth saying that from a nuclear perspective, the production of fuels and heat may be way more important than the production of electricity. But wait, nuclear is so unpopular. And it is, we've got a pretty bad rap. I mean, here's the kind of birth of the environmental movement. It grew up out of the peace movement, and the kind of people that were most present in that movement were women and young people. And even today, we see the largest gap in terms of gender to attitudes to nuclear. So men are twice as likely to support nuclear as women, basically. And, one explanation for that is that actually this sort of anti-nuclear environmental movement grew up out of the peace movement, conflated opposition to nuclear bombs and nuclear bombs testing and nuclear war with opposition to nuclear energy. And we even, we're hearing about this kind of link, lingering on today. What's the link between civil nuclear energy and nuclear proliferation? I mean, one thing that we do know is that hands down, the most successful non-proliferation effort ever has been the megatons to megawatts program, which disposed of 20,000 Soviet warheads in nuclear power stations, and the beautiful poetic idea that the bombs that were designed to blow up our cities were used to light up our cities, as Stuart Brand said. But okay, back to the stats, right? So about 40% of people in the UK, if you just ask them directly, do you support nuclear energy? They'll say yes, about 40% of people do. Remains fairly consistent, similar in the US. But really, actually, what we know about these public opinion polling things is that it depends on what you ask and when you ask them and how you ask them and who you ask. And one thing that we know is that consistently, if you ask people, do you support nuclear and renewables as part of a mix, support jumps from the 40% that we're kind of familiar with bumping along up to 75 or even 80%. In the United States, in the UK, which is mainly the two kind of research areas that I've looked at. Here's just a few examples of that, just to show you there's consistently that's what we find. And in the UK, we applied that insight that consistently it's more popular than 100% renewables, or do you just support nuclear? If you ask people, do you support a mix? Generally, you'll get a much, much larger amount of support. We applied that insight to create the Low Carbon Alliance between the nuclear, renewables, and carbon capture and storage industries. And you can see over there on all those logos, somewhere in there is the nuclear industry logo that was published on Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace campaign material because they recognized that actually that was a useful way for them to gain real cross-party political support for decarbonisation of electricity if they included, all the zero carbon options. And most recently, we've been doing a study with National Renewable Energy Lab looking at future energy systems and modelling whether advanced reactors in future energy systems could help us to meet our objectives for a future energy system, which is basically what do we want from our future energy system? We want it to be clean and reliable and affordable and flexible. So I'm going to talk you through this chart. So this is installed capacity here. This is today. This is from New England. We've modelled a whole bunch of system operators in the United States. This is the New England one, which is about 30 million people. You can see today you've got a lot of gas on the system. You've got a small amount of renewables. You've got a little bit of nuclear. This is the 2034 baseline from the National Renewable Energy Lab's scenario, which has high renewables penetration and low cost of gas. So we figured, quite ambitious scenario. You can see a lot of wind and solar gets added there. And then on this one, we added the dotted chart there, the dotted bit there is advanced nuclear with energy storage. And then over here, you've got the generating capacity. So let's see what happens, because installed capacity and generating capacity, of course, are different. I don't need to explain that to everyone, I'm sure. So you've got a lot of gas generating today. You can see in the 2034 baseline, you've still got a lot of gas on the system. Even though you've got a lot of renewables generating too, that's the combination, again, that I mentioned earlier. If you add in advanced nuclear into the system, it crushes out the gas. Now, I'm not allowed to say that in America. The DOE don't like it. But when we care about decarbonisation, we care about getting to zero carbon, we care about doing that as cheaply as possible and with a smaller footprint as possible. And what we found is that the advanced nuclear partners really, really well with the wind and solar. And just to sort of illustrate that here's a little zoom in. So we have a week in mid-July. So we've got seasonal solar peak. You can see the gas is load following pretty much with the wind and solar in the top. And at the bottom here, you can see how the advanced reactors are essentially load following just like a gas plant. And so the reason for this study was to inform upstream design decisions for reactor developers, to tell them what the capital cost would be allowable and what their products would need to do. So what are the cost and performance criteria for those products to be useful in future energy systems? And what we advise them is, frankly, they need to be really flexible like a gas plant is, and they need to be cheap. Because the electricity markets in the 2030s, let me tell you, they're going to be tough. We're talking about sort of $20 per megawatt hour on average for electricity prices. So not an easy market to go into, but overall, with the advanced reactors, if they can hit those CapEx targets, with energy storage, so the thermal storage is an interesting feature. It's the model that we used was just bricks. So you heat up the bricks, and then over a 12-hour period, you can either be charging to the grid or charging your battery, which is your thermal storage, which is what allows you to load follow. But it means that your 500 megawatt capacity reactor with 2 turbines could potentially have 1,000 megawatts of output. So it's nice. It's kind of neat. And we've actually now scaled that study up to become a campaign of the Clean Energy Ministerial. So the Clean Energy Ministerial is the annual meeting of energy ministers that try to, work out how they're going to deliver on the targets that are set at the climate talks. So at the Paris commitments, for example, they're like, how do we do that? And it's been running for about a decade, and they've always excluded nuclear. Nuclear never had a presence until about 2 years ago, when nuclear was allowed in, and some countries got together and created an initiative called the Nuclear Innovation for a Clean Energy Future Initiative. And we now have a campaign looking at how nuclear and renewables can work together to support clean, reliable, affordable, and flexible future energy systems. And we have our 3 NGOs, and Energy for Humanity, Energy Options Network, and ClearPath, working on that. And Canada, US, Japan, UK, and France are all participating and modelling advanced reactors into their future energy systems to see how those technologies could help improve the prospects. So this is my last kind of couple of slides here, which is just to sort of set you thinking. So this is, sorry it's busy, it's a mind map, but I've been advised that you will have access to these slides if you would like them after this talk. So I figured rather than strip it all out, I would leave it all in, and then hopefully that will generate further discussions and ongoing conversations. So my main sort of thinking here is that we need to move towards a whole system mindset. So what would happen if we started to frame the whole discussion in terms of whole system thinking? So, that idea that we want to move towards the highest performing system, clean, reliable, affordable, flexible. Imagine if the energy transition was actually being designed to achieve those outcomes. And I heard Frederick say, what we often do is confuse the means with the ends. And I think actually that's entirely what we are doing. We're confusing the means with the ends and focusing on technology deployment instead of the performance of the whole system. And if we thought about it in terms of the whole system, not only in terms of the performance of the system, but also being clean and resource efficient and climate friendly and protecting nature and abundant and scalable in a genuinely technology neutral way, then what would change? Imagine if we committed as much resource and effort to increasing the deployment and driving down costs for all low-carbon technologies that are identified as being necessary by the IPCC. The lion's share of effort and resources is currently being spent on renewables, and it is delivering results. Yes, it's driving down costs. Yes, it's increasing deployment. Imagine if we applied that same effort and resource to all the technologies. And of course, if we didn't have the technology tribalism that's really hampering our efforts, hindering our efforts to determine the best approaches, what would change? Whose interests does it even serve to differentiate between these technologies? Imagine if we applied the whole system perspective to decarbonize the entire economy, not just the power sector, but if we genuinely thought about the application of all of the technologies available to us today to decarbonize liquid fuels, transport industry and so on as well, rather than just focusing on the power sector, what would change? And what would happen if we applied all of the learning from the successful reduction in cost and increased rates of deployment to all low-carbon technologies? If we really made a consistent determination to enable cost reduction and high deployment for all those technologies, what would change? So my last slide is when we were at the IAEA conference on climate change recently. Calais and I were both there, and some others. Someone asked the question, why doesn't IRENA merge with the IAEA? So the International Renewable Energy Agency merge with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And I had this kind of weird, uncomfortable feeling when I think about that. And I think what it shows is just how differently we think about nuclear and renewables. In fact, in every way, there's this total inconsistency in terms of access to finance, the regulatory burden, the policy support that's available, the advocacy. There's a study by Matthew Nisbet that shows he looked at $500 million worth of philanthropic spending on climate change, and he found that lion's share gets spent on renewables advocacy. Guess how much gets spent on nuclear advocacy? We've established it's an important climate mitigation tool, right? Guess how much those philanthropies are spending on climate advocacy? I'll tell you, 0. In fact, there was a small amount of money being spent opposing nuclear energy. But what this thought experiment shows us is actually how wide the gap really is in terms of access to finance, and we'll hear more about that from Jessica, citing consistent independent regulation, investment in supply chain development, project management. So all our climate solutions need to be impossible burgers. We've created successfully meat substitutes that have now saturated the market. We need substitutes for all of our fossil fuel applications. We need them very fast, and they need to be very cheap, and they have to be at climate scale. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
So thank you for a great presentation. I'm going to open up for a couple of questions, but before I do that, it's just it's kind of striking the difference in how you portray, for example, the costs. And I don't want to get us bogged down in the cost issue, but I just got to ask, because it's a common argument, at least in the Nordic context, that if this is so good and so cheap, why aren't people investing? Because there's nothing stopping companies investing, and still they don't. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, so, we're now seeing something like there's more than 60 entrepreneurial startup companies in the United States, and there's companies all over the world, in Sweden, in Finland, in the UK, everywhere, productizing work that was done in national labs. So turning, to startup companies to develop nuclear technologies. But that's never happened before in nuclear. Nuclear's always been a kind of state-led enterprise and is, broadly speaking, badly misrepresented in the sustainable finance community. And in addition to that, you have a sort of situation which makes it very risky for an investor, because you have an unknown length of time for regulation, for licensing new plants, and then even once you've successfully licensed a new reactor in a country, if you want to build it anywhere else, you have to license it all over again. And if you want to build a second reactor somewhere else, you have a very laborious siting process to undertake. So the context within which these developers are working is extremely challenging and very high risk from an investor perspective. So what can we do to change that would be a useful question to ask.
Yeah, and what would your answer be to that in the short term? So can we actually expect a kind of a reasonable electricity market reform to deliver the values that you see in nuclear, or would you need much more sort of heavy-handed government intervention in order to drive the development that you can envision in your presentation?
Yeah, I mean, for gigawatt scale conventional light water reactors, first of all, establishing a programmatic approach is a proven way to drive costs down to what would be very competitive prices with fossil fuels and renewables. So committing to a program is one thing. So if you make the upfront investment in licensing, in qualifying your supply chain, you don't need to make the regulatory regime less onerous. You just commit to a program, and then that upfront investment will be an investment literally in driving down costs over time as you standardize your design and you make repeat builds. That's very straightforward. Beyond that, for the next generation of reactors, the small modular reactors and the advanced reactors, we really have to think about making our regulatory regime, much more responsive to the needs of the global markets. And that means, for example, standardizing codes and standards, as we do in aviation and in other sectors, to enable developers to be able to build in multiple jurisdictions without needing to, relicense and change their design every time.
Do we have any questions from the floor, audience? No? Then I have another one, because I kind of want to linger on this market issue, because to me, there's this kind of conflict between the very large-scale investments that we see are needed and the very capacity-intense character of nuclear power, and the development, the cost reductions, the kind of deployment-driven cost reductions that we've seen in solar in particular, and also wind to some extent. It's kind of hard to imagine that in nuclear. So my question is, how can we avoid, and you've touched upon a little bit, how can we avoid all the plants being kind of first of a kind in some way? Licensing and regulations is one example where just moving from, I would imagine, from France to Sweden, say, would almost put you in a first-of-a-kind situation, even with the same kind of technology.
Yeah.
Do you see that as a major barrier? And if so, how would we kind of avoid that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we've seen with the EDF's EPR. So, they're building the same design in China, Finland, UK and France. And actually each country has made very substantial changes to the design as a result of regulatory interventions, which leads to very large implications in terms of cost and design engineering. The codes and standards, even in the UK, if you wanted to build an AP1000 and an EPR, two kinds of reactor, and you went to a turbine supplier, almost to get the same thing, what you'd have is an entirely different set of codes and standards for each design, which is, it doesn't sound like a big deal, but it's unbelievably resource intense, and it requires, satisfying the regulator. It's all in the substantiation, all of which requires a lot of investment, all of which creates risk, all of which contributes towards additional delays. So the whole thing rolls on. So, taking a step back, and we're advocating for an open architecture approach where you standardize interfaces to enable suppliers to be able to basically have standardized codes and standards that meet regulatory requirements, but that do not require that sort of bespoke approach every single time, which really drives a lot of cost.
All right, thanks, Frederick.
It was interesting you brought this up with standardization, and I think you're right, that is like the key to drive the cost down. Mm-hmm. But I do not like this, you make this, how fast have you built nuclear compared to renewables, because it has so little to do with the technology, I think, and so much about the social system. So when we built the nuclear power, by the increasing electricity demand, we have a state-regulated electricity market, and it was a state effort. Yeah. So then, of course, things went really smoothly. Now we have a stable electricity demand, more or less, which means it's much more difficult for new things to come up, and that's when we built the renewables. And we have a more market-oriented kind of setting. And now you're talking about this kind of normalizing the licensing over countries. I mean, that process would probably take a decade if people even want to do it. Mm-hmm. So I think that is a really strong reason to think that how the social system looks today is actually reason to believe nuclear will be quite slow and not at all as fast as it was in the 70s. Mm. So that comparison hasn't to do so much with technology, but about the social system.
Interesting. So if we're talking about Sweden and the electricity system here, why on earth are you talking about replacing one clean source of electricity generating capacity with another? That, to me, it's bonkers. Really, we have a much larger decarbonisation challenge. We haven't yet decarbonised transport and industry, particularly here. Absolutely add more electricity generating capacity to contribute towards electrification. But this whole idea of like this versus that, to me, it doesn't make sense, frankly. And so,
but when you made the argument, nuclear is faster than renewables, and my point is, it hasn't to do with the technology; it has to do with the social setting when those were built.
Yeah. So I was getting confused whether you were talking about the social situation in Sweden. But if you're talking about the larger social situation, like for example in the rest of Europe, so if you look at countries that have a real dependency on coal, Germany, for example, this is a good example actually why this really isn't about nuclear versus renewables. And I really hope that I didn't give that impression that I'm arguing nuclear versus renewables. I'm actually arguing about nuclear versus coal. And the reason for that is because we know that energy systems that have successfully transitioned from fossil fuels have done that through a combination of wind and solar and hydro and nuclear. And so really that's the point. And in Germany is proving that it's not possible to exit nuclear and coal at the same time. So yes, absolutely get the wind and solar built, at a faster rate. Although you'll notice that in countries that have already built a lot of wind and solar, like Germany and in the UK, we're seeing a very, very sharp decline in the build rates, because what you don't see in the sort of Excel sheet trajectories is the inherent constraints within the social system, within the fact that the good sites get used quickly, and then you start to encounter more public opposition. The more penetration that you build, you've got less transmission necessarily, and that's also going to encounter a lot of social opposition. All of that contributes towards longer planning inquiries, which increases investor risk. And then the next thing last year we built one onshore wind project in the UK. One. So we do need to think carefully about the social context and the inherent risks and inherent in all of these pathways, and mitigate against them by having parallel tracks.
Thanks a lot, and you're going to have a chance to continue the conversation in the panel. I look forward to that, actually. Now we have coffee. Never stand between a Swede and his coffee. So coffee's upstairs, I think.
Thanks.
Correct. And let's be back here at past at the very latest. So 15 minutes from now.